Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get things kicked off here. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Calcano, and I am the director of All Oregon Votes. We are a statewide citizen grassroots ballot measure campaign to end closed primaries and bring about open primaries in Oregon. And that's a piece of our discussion today. But the bigger theme of tonight's event is going to be a town hall discussion, which is bringing in some panelists who have been doing a lot of great work in the pro-democracy reform space, policies that are designed to give more power to voters, which we all deserve to have more choice and more voice and better representation in government. And that's ultimately the American experiment that we're constantly evolving from, is citizens coming together, talking about ideas and ways that we can build a more perfect union. And so that's the general premise of today's event. I hope that you came to the right room. I'm so invigorated by all of the amazing people who care to tune in and listen to this conversation, who care to be doing the work to move the needle, to make our democracy work better for everybody. So thank you for being here. One life lesson I got from a first grader I talked to recently was hope. Hope is believing in yourself, believing in others, and believing in your dreams. And I know it sounds trite, but I certainly have hope for the future and for building a better state and a better nation. And so I'm so happy to be here. And with that, I want to introduce our panelists. And so I think we'll start off with Sandra, and then Sath, and then Marty, and then Alan. So we'll go in that order. If you could just give maybe a minute introduction about yourself and just say hi to everyone.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. My name's Sandra Cosgrove. I'm a history professor at the College of Southern Nevada, so I am in Las Vegas. As a community college history professor, I do a lot of civics education in my classes. So that often means that when we have elections, reporters call me because they maybe don't understand one of our election processes, or when we've got legislative session going on. And I just find a lot of times people don't know enough about civics to be engaged. They just don't know and understand where to start a process. And I think everybody should have the ability to be engaged. So that's what I do a lot, is just help people to understand civics.
Well, yeah, I am Sass. I am the operations coordinator for the Equal Votes Coalition. I'm currently in Eugene, Oregon, working on this stuff. You know, I ran for U.S. House of Representatives back when I lived in Austin, Texas, only a couple of years ago. And I knew voting method reform was really important. And so I looked more into it and discovered the rich, wonderful world of all the really incredible reforms that there are, and just how powerful they could be in transforming our entire society, really. And it felt like the most efficient use of the seconds in my day to affect positive change in the world. That's really what it's all about for me. I care about the well-being of people on the planet. Thanks.
Hello, I am Marty Wilde. I am a 28-year military officer, mostly in the Air National Guard. I have to disclose that my opinions are my own, not those necessarily of my employer. I just finished up 4 years as a state representative, where I represented a swing district. And there I advocated for what I used to call the big three: campaign finance reform, nonpartisan redistricting, and open primaries. So thanks for all of your interest in this, and a special greeting to my predecessor, Bill Barnhart, who I see is in the audience.
I'm Alan Zundell. I was a political scientist for a good part of my working life, actually at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I left that to become more active in electoral reform efforts, because I could see my area was public policy, and I could see that a lot of policies, good policies, in my opinion, were being stalled by the electoral system that we're trying to deal with. So subsequent to that, I was an activist for ranked choice voting for quite a while, helped get it in Benton County here in Oregon, and also ran for Secretary of State as a Green Party candidate to talk about ranked choice voting. I served on Dennis Richardson's working group to talk about redistricting reform in 2017, I think. And then I moved from RCV, ranked choice voting, to star voting, which was invented in 2014 and I heard about in 2016, because I saw it as so much more effective and simpler than ranked choice voting. Hasn't been tried in the real world too much. I mean, in public elections, but it's been tried a lot in private situations. And I think has a lot of potential. So we're currently mounting a statewide initiative campaign to try to bring star voting to Oregon.
So that is the rundown of our panelists. Larry Morgan is also a panelist and he's running a little late. And so hopefully he will be here by the time we dive into the meat of our town hall discussion. But before we dive into that, I wanted to level set. I wanted to try to ground the work that we're doing in the voices of regular, ordinary Oregonians across the state. And I'm so grateful that we have a wonderful nonprofit, nonpartisan organization in Oregon that does research and surveys about representative sample sizes, scientific polling, and data called the Oregon Values and Belief Center. And I just wanted to start off with a small snapshot of the way in which regular voters across our state describe the political system that we have today and how they feel about it. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a screen share because I think it's a really great way to get a snapshot of where we're at with the sentiment among voters today. So someone writes in, greed is the driving force of capitalism and that drive for wealth trumps all other ends. Democracy has become a circus to keep the less well-off imagining we have a say. This is a very liberal, independent Washington County voter, female, 65 to 74 years old. Elections are driven by the rich. Politicians are a weird breed of people who seem to care most about their status, not their constituents. This is a middle-of-the-road, independent Marion County voter, female, 18 to 29 years old. I think politicians are more focused on economic and monetary gain than the environment and concerns of people. They are more focused on pushing their own party's agenda than making the world and the country a better place. This is a somewhat conservative Democrat, Polk County voter, female, 18 to 29 years old. The two-party first past the post system that we have in place in America is directly proportional to the advancement of extremism that we're seeing today. Somewhat conservative, independent Lynn County voter, female, 45 to 54 years old. Gerrymandering of voting districts is disenfranchising voters. The shaming and bullying of conservative legislators by their own party when they don't follow the party line discourages them from voting their conscience. That's a somewhat liberal Democrat, Grant County voter, female, 65 to 74 years old. I don't care or put any trust in politics. I believe my vote makes little difference because nothing is ever improved for homeless people or the quality of life for those with mental illness. And I see no change based on who is control. Middle of the road, independent Marion County voter, female, 55 to 64 years old. The two-party system of Democrats and Republicans ruling everything needs to change. We need more seats at the table in order to better represent our communities. Middle of the road, independent, Coos County voter, female, 30 to 44 years old. Abolish political parties. They have outlived their usefulness and they are now purely toxic. Politicians should be serving the people, not their party. That's a somewhat conservative independent Columbia County voter, non-binary, 45 to 54 years old. Any move away from the two-party control of who is allowed to be a candidate would be a step in the right direction. The two-party system is not functional. It is broken and does not represent the voters. That's a somewhat conservative, independent Lane County voter, a woman 65 to 74 years old. It would be nice to break the two-party monopoly in this country. Middle of the road, independent Wasco County voter, a man 65 to 74 years old. I'm afraid that only the loudest, most extreme voices are being heard and making the decisions for everyone. I think people are only surrounding themselves with voices that are in agreement. Somewhat conservative, independent Jackson County voter, Southern Oregon, a woman 18 to 29 years old. As long as there are essentially zero restrictions on campaign finance and dark money, it really doesn't matter and won't really change anything but the window dressing. Somewhat liberal, independent Multnomah County voter, a man 65 to 74 years old. I do not like that the parties are funding a primary opponent, party member, who they think would be an easier candidate to beat in the general election. Democrats funding a MAGA election results denier, that does not seem right. A middle of the road Republican Washington County voter, a man 65 to 74 years old. So all of these comments and sentiments, I'm sure, are shared, at least some of them, by many of us in this room. And that's why we're called to do this work, is to address the needs of voters who feel like they don't matter and that the two-party system is more important than their voice. When we look at who votes in Oregon, it's important to understand the dynamics of our electorate in our state. About a third of all registered voters are Democrats in Oregon, and about a quarter are Republicans. And it's these two voting groups who get an outsized influence in our political system because of the two-party framework that we create. And they're able to crowd out the vast majority, the vast plurality of voters in our state who are independents. But we're not aligned as independents, which is the problem. So we're either not a member of a party or we might belong to a third party. But in any regard, the rights of independents are far lower than the rights that are in statute today for the two-party system. And again, we have really great data thanks to the Oregon Values and Belief Center. They asked voters the question, should we keep the primary closed to just party members? Continue the practice of closed primaries. Of registered Democrats, only a quarter of them say that they actually want to retain the restrictions that the closed primary provides. And of registered Republicans, only about 36% of them want to retain this restricted voting system of the closed primary. So we can see that there's a sentiment amongst voters who want to see open primaries. And I want Dr. Sandra Cosgrove to talk about this in Nevada because it was a big element of their success for their recent statewide ballot measure campaign, is ensuring that all voices have the right to participate in all publicly funded elections.
Sure, absolutely. Ready?
Well, it's just, Sandra, I'll come to you at the end, but let's
At
loop
the
back
end,
around
okay,
to that.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I want to do is rewind the clock 8 months ago so that we can understand what happened in the governor's race. This teal bar represents about 3 million registered voters in Oregon. That is to ratio how many voters that we have. Now, we have a yellow bar on the left and a yellow bar on the right. And those are registered Democrats on the left in that yellow box and registered Republicans on the right. But of all registered Democrats, it's about 17% of the electorate that's turning out. So about half of Democrats are actually participating. And similarly, 13% of the electorate is voting in the Republican primary. So it's about half of registered Republicans who are actually turning their ballot back. Tina Kotek is the front runner from the primary, and she emerges with about 9% support of the electorate. And Christine Drazan is the front runner who captures the GOP nomination on the right. And she has support from about 3%, less than 3% of all voters in Oregon. And meanwhile, you have about 69% of voters who are not counted in this result. And there's not much we can do if you're a registered party member and you don't turn in your ballot. But the disenfranchised independents, they don't even get a ballot, right? They don't even get the chance to participate in these elections for state offices and federal offices. The most important, most powerful offices, 40% of the electorate was boxed out. They were restricted from voting in Oregon in the primary, right? So ultimately, why do we care? Well, we care about the future. We have to have hope for the future, that we're building something bright for our children and grandchildren. And these are my two kids. You may have your own children and grandchildren, and you may want to see a better future for them. And I think when we create a stronger democracy, we create a stronger future for the next generation. So at the time of the primary, we had 4.3 million people living in our state, men, women, children, and when you eliminate those who are under 18, you're left with 3.4 million people. And then when you look at just who's registered to vote, it's around 3 million, 2.9. But Oregon is just one of 9 states left that injects that injects this artificial closed partisan primary system that partitions our voters, right? So we segregate voters based on party affiliation. We restrict 1.2 million voters and we elevate 1.7 million voters with extra voting rights. So we have 1.2 million independents, 1 million Democrats, and 750,000 Republicans, right? But only half of the Democrats vote, only half of the Republicans vote. And this is to scale. The sliver of red represents 85,000 raw votes of support for the frontrunner of the GOP nomination. And Tina Kotek captures the frontrunner status with 275,000 votes. But something really important to understand in terms of principles of democracy is the question, should 85,000, a candidate who receives 85,000 votes, should that candidate go on and supersede a candidate who receives 156,000 votes? Well, in a closed party primary state like Oregon, the runner-up Tobias Reed, who was the Democrat, the second in line, the second place Democrat, he received nearly twice the vote total of Christine Drazan, and yet our system restricted him from competing in the general election. So if you voted for Tobias Reed, your vote was effectively about half as valuable as a vote for Christine Drazan because of our party primary system that's closed to independents and restricts voting. And it channels only one Democrat and only one Republican, right? We have to understand why this system's in place and who it's harming. Among that 1.2 million independent voter group, disproportionately disenfranchised are Hispanic voters, Asian American voters, voters who are Gen Z and millennials, veterans, naturalized immigrants, and we know from good solid data, lower income Oregonians. So when we think about democracy and when we think about social justice and who controls levers of power and who is disproportionately locked out of institutions that shape our culture and society, we know it's these groups who have been historically marginalized. So again, we have a teal bar, the blue on the left and the red on the right. And the reality 8 months ago is that 88% of registered voters did not voice support for either Tina Kotek or Christine Drazan to advance to the general. So it's no wonder that voters express this sentiment that their vote doesn't matter, or that they don't like any of the candidates on their ballot in the general election, or that they have to choose the lesser of two evils here. It's because we're shutting out so many voices across our state. And it was this gentleman, Boss Tweed, who said, I don't care who does the electing so long as I get to do the nominating. And because we have this exodus from the two-party systems, fewer and fewer people get to do the nominating, and then everyone else gets to do the electing. And that keeps entrenched interests and power in our state. So we have to do something to revitalize this. The bottom line is that, are we the people in charge of the democracy, or are the two parties in charge of the democracy, right? That's ultimately what we have to solve. And we believe that candidates who win office by partisan primary are incentivized to govern to benefit their supporting special interests. And that undermines liberty and justice for all. It undermines public interest policymaking. It was a famous American president who said this about parties: they kindle animosity of one part against another. They foment riot and insurrection. They open the door to foreign influence and corruption. And that finds a facilitated access to government itself through channels of party passion. This was America's only independent president in the history of our nation. Our first president, George Washington, a man of many talents, but also a fortune teller who foretold foreign influence and corruption. So this has a ripple effect across our state. The public sector is an important, incredibly valuable asset to us as citizens, right? We pay taxes so the public sector can do things like healthcare and education and criminal justice, public safety, can solve things like housing and homelessness, can run a effective criminal justice system, a fair criminal justice system, can provide mental health services. So when a public sector is faltering, we all feel the ripple effects downstream. And so open primaries and these other pro-democracy reforms that are on the table today help to create a more functional system of governance. So we can and will write Oregon history to restore a healthy democracy and revitalize the public sector, right? That's why we're gathered here today. So we have a new route to getting to the open primary. Our proposal is Initiative Petition 16. Electors in a primary shall have the opportunity to vote for any candidate for each office on their ballot, regardless of party affiliation or non-affiliation of the elector or candidate. You know, we think that this constitutional amendment is a really great way to trigger the open primary discussion and to catalyze action and to catalyze a public process. Because there are, of course, different ways that you can shape the primary. The two main options for primary elections are the separated partisan primary and the integrated open primary. The partisan primary is really an election for party choice, and it's conducted on two different tickets, two different ballots. The integrated open primary is conducted on one common ballot, and that's a voter choice election, right? So there's the partisan closed system, and that's our existing system today. And then there's another flavor, the semi-open system, but in either case, both of those are restricted ballots. You're limited as a voter from free choice. With the integrated open primary, which is a voter choice primary, you can adopt an open top two, which is what Washington State has and California has, or you could adopt an open top four, and that's what Alaska has, and that's what Nevada is moving toward. And so we really think that it's time in Oregon to phase out this separated partisan, this restricted voting system in the primary that boxes out so many voices and usher in a new era for an integrated open primary. And we want the legislature in Oregon and a public process to create the outcome of Initiative Petition 16. And so it helps to visualize things. If you're a Democrat in Oregon, you had the choice between Kurt Schrader and Jamie McLeod Skinner. And if you were wearing a red jersey, you could choose between Crumpacker and Chavez DeRemer and DePaula. But if you didn't want to wear a jersey, don't worry about it. This election is not for you. You don't need to show up. You don't need to participate. Your voice really shouldn't be involved here, but you should help us pay for it. So $4.8 million of public sector funding is bankrolling the GOP ballot, is bankrolling the Democratic Party ballot. The public sector funding that bankrolls these things is supporting a restrictive voting paradigm, and that's just wrong. So why don't we think about a better system where we can take all candidates from all stripes and have them compete equally? So you have Chavez DeRemer and Kurt Schrader and Crumpacker and McLeod Skinner and DePaula, but you also have third-party candidates who can represent other voters. So again, more choice and more voice. You can have a Green Party candidate listed right next to a non-traditional outsider candidate, next to a non-affiliated conservative candidate, next to a progressive Democrat candidate, next to our elections get a lot more interesting and intriguing and exciting and competitive again when you factor in diverse candidates, again, more choice and more voice, third-party leaders, civil servants who don't want to affiliate with partisan politics, accomplished outsiders, non-traditional disruptors. This integrated open primary system, it's been around in Nebraska since 1934. Louisiana adopted it in 1975, Washington State in 2004, California in 2010, Alaska, voters adopted it in 2020. And last on this list, Dr. Sandra Cosgrove, Nevada in 2022. And of course, we have an asterisk there because your work continues. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because I want to kick it over to our panel. And Dr. Sandra Cosgrove, can you share with us your big win in November for open primaries in Nevada and what you were hearing. What was the sentiment of the electorate there in Nevada? Because you are a closed partisan primary state, right?
Right. If I pulled up our PowerPoint presentation that we use for a ballot question, it would look almost exactly like the PowerPoint presentation you just gave. We've got the chart showing, it's third Democrat, third Republican, a third and growing nonpartisan voters. Turnout is very low. The number of people who are actually nominating the folks that go to the general election, we're like a mirror reflection of what's happening in Oregon. And so we've got the same complaints here, that people don't feel heard. They feel like it's the special interests who are always in control of things. But when I talk to people and they're like, well, no, the parties should be able to have their own primaries. But so I say, if you can give me just a minute to do a little history lesson, I can probably change your mind. And I noticed you threw in some history. I knew who that quote was from. Because if you look at the original Constitution without any of the amendments, it doesn't say anything about voting. It talks about who can run, who can be in Congress and the Electoral College, but it doesn't really say who can vote or how they vote. That's just kicked over to the states because there was so much acrimony over the states wanting to enfranchise in some cases and not in others. And then Washington, gave that warning about the political parties, and they're like, no, parties aren't going to pop up. We're too diverse. And then, of course, two parties pop up, and they literally kind of take hold of our governing system. And if you look at the expansion of voting rights all the way up until about 1900, the progressive period, voters were allowed to vote to give the parties more power. They wanted to control their voters so that you could vote for them, so they could have power, so that they could vote for the things they wanted. It wasn't voting rights for you, it was voting rights for them. But when we talk about the Gilded Age and we talk about corruption, we talk about the robber barons. No, the problem was political corruption. That, you brought up Boss Tweed, he's from the Gilded Age. The political process of the parties were horribly corrupt, so our economy was corrupt. So the progressives said, okay, checks and balances, we actually have to have people be a check and a balance. So we need more people voting. We need the initiative, the referendum, the recall. We need to elect judges. We need to elect all of our civil servants. We need the people to be an effective check against the political parties because they didn't know how to unwind the parties or how to stop them because they're like parasites in the system. They're so entrenched in it. If you try and pull it out, you might destroy the system. And so when I explain it that way, that we're supposed to be a check, checks and balances, we're supposed to be a check. Are we a check in this current system? Not with a closed primary, we're not. Not with the way, we have campaign finance, we're not. So we have got to keep that momentum that's been going for 100 years, that we, the people, have to be an effective check on government. The only way that's going to happen is to have open primaries, which we know based on a case out of Washington is allowed. If it's a publicly financed primary, we, the voters, we decide what the primary looks like. And then from there, we're going to do top 5. Alaska did top 4. We want to have as much choice as we possibly can moving forward into the general election. So just like you showed, so everybody sees a candidate they can relate to and feel like, well, hey, wait a minute, my voice can be heard and I can have a say in this because I see myself represented in the candidates. And then with ranked choice voting, to me, that's consensus politics. And Michael was actually on when we interviewed Mary Peltola from Alaska, who's the first Indigenous woman to be elected to Congress from Alaska, and it was because of open primary and ranked choice voting. That's how she did it. And she explained, she says that as an Indigenous person, tribal politics is consensus-based. You have to talk to everybody. You don't say negative things. You try to reach that point where everybody agrees. So she said, for me, ranked choice voting, no problem. I know how to reach consensus, and I did it. And so when I saw her and I listened to her say that, I'm like, yeah, that's why I've got to do this. And we've got to make sure that Nevada has open primary with ranked choice voting because that's what I want to.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandra, so much. Representative Wilde, can you chime in a little bit about your reaction to some of those statistics or the state of reality today, and what led you to care so much about fixing gerrymandering, fixing the closed primary, and trying to tackle some of these pro-democracy reforms?
Well, I think you start with your values, right? That's what the good advice I got. And if I asked you, anybody, would you prefer a politician who's primarily loyal to a party or primarily loyal to the people? We'd say, well, of course. I mean, to the people, because you swear an oath and all that stuff. But when you look at the incentives, how they line up in the current system, they line up in favor of party loyalty. And that's because roughly 90% of districts are not competitive. So to win the general election, you win the primary. And, they're not competitive because they're overwhelmingly Democratic or overwhelmingly Republican. So you got to get through a primary. But after that, you're set. What does that mean? Well, folks like me who represented swing districts, it's really difficult because you're the party is pulling you into the direction of the primary elector of that party, because it's not just half the party that's voting in the primary. It's the most passionate and often extreme part of that party. The people who are a little more ambivalent or a little more moderate tend to vote less. And so what you get is an election that selects, the farthest right or the farthest left in the closed primary. And then, half the electorate's kind of left holding their nose in the general election. Well, I vote Democratic, but boy, this guy's pretty far left. Or, I usually vote Republican, but I don't like, how far right. There was an article, I think it was in the Post today, that did an analysis and determined that the polarization had increased since the 1970s as more and more districts became safe. Why are more and more districts safe? Well, if there's one thing the parties agree on, is that they don't want to have to spend money in swing districts, and swing district elections are expensive. And so because we don't have campaign finance reform here in Oregon, that allows them to concentrate large amounts of money in there. So I'll give you an example of how this plays out. My example, we can talk about it, but there's something a little more current, and that's should public employees who now reside out of state receive public funds to travel back to Oregon for necessary meetings? The public overwhelmingly believes that they should not. And in fact, every single state senator signed on to sponsor a bill that said, hey, look, you can't, expect the state to pay if you live out of state and work remotely, which is fine. I mean, it's a completely legitimate perspective. So what happened? Well, Melissa Unger from SEIU, an organization that repeatedly supported me, came forward and said, we don't think that's fair. People moved under the reliance that they would be paid basically to travel forever and do that. And so what happened next? Well, the chair of the committee, hearing it, who, like all the senators, had signed on to the bill, started saying, well, maybe we won't pass this bill. I don't really support it in its current form. Well, why did you sign on to it then? So you see, why does SEIU matter that much? They really come out to bat, both in terms of money and on the ground volunteers. And they're not evil people. I generally support their agenda, but that role is really not aligned with the values of the people. And because we have the system we do, and they play such a large role, both in funding and these closed primaries, and especially in safe Democratic districts, suddenly the chair of that committee, who is in a safe Democratic district and funded by SEIU, is not doing what the people want. So I'm not trying to fault her. She lives in the world that we've created, but it shows us how these incentives run contrary to the values that we profess. Thanks.
Just a comment, when you say, these safe seats, right? In the latest 2020 cycle, the statistic is that just 8% of American voters elected 83% of Congress. So out of 435 US House seats, a staggering 359 of them were decided in the primary, right? So this confluence of gerrymandering of the safe seats and then the closed partisan primary, it means fewer and fewer and fewer people are actually deciding on who's going to serve in office. And usually they're more ideological voters, right? Dr. Zundel, can you share with us a little bit of your reaction to some of the conversation here, and a lot of what fuels you as you think about this work that we're doing to create a better democracy for the future?
Reflections on what's just been said. I mean, the presentation you did is very familiar to me. We've been more and more voters are disaffiliating from the major parties, more and more voters year after year, decade after decade, really, through most of my life, through most of my lifetime, and I'm not that young. Voters have been getting more and more disgusted with the electoral system and just dropping out of the process, which makes it worse and worse because it's left to the people who are, happy with the way things are for one reason or another. The second question was something about
what fuels your
What fuels
I mean, you could be doing anything you wanted to be doing, right? Why do you stick with this work? You're working on voting method changes, right? You're helping pitch in on the primary question.
Well, Marty Wilde just talked about one area where the public is pretty unified. And according to public polls, there's a lot of unity across the nation for voters who want particularly things like reducing military spending, increasing taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and addressing climate change. Sounds like a Democratic agenda, but even the Democratic Party is not always on board with this. And I think it's because of the money and politics situation. So what I'm seeing is a world that's declining decade after decade, with people feeling more economic insecurity. There's being more wars or constant wars in the world. There's climate change escalating into current disasters, not future hypothetical disasters. And I care about the world and the people in it. And I care about my children and their generation and my grandchildren and their generation. And that's probably what fuels me the most. Plus, it's kind of inertia. I've been working on this stuff for so many decades. I don't want to give up until I can't stand up anymore.
What was your takeaway from participating in the Independent Redistricting Task Force in 2017 that was aimed to really fight gerrymandering and take the power away from the legislature for drawing the lines and put it into a hands of a nonpartisan citizen commission? Did you have any gem that you want to share with us about that process?
The process, I'd say one thing is that although I don't want to just dump on Democrats because I see the same kind of things from the Republican Party, but Democrats complained because there weren't many Democrats on that commission. Only one, really, Jeff Parker, who's no longer in the legislature. But what I was told on the other side from some aides to Senator Richardson, they invited Democrats, but they didn't want to participate. And why? Because obviously the Democrats have a majority. They have an advantage in redistricting. They don't want to give it up. But I think on the other side, the interest of the Republicans in redistricting reform was, well, we'll be better off under that since we don't have a majority right now. So I saw each side to my interpretation, were motivated by partisan advantage and not necessarily the well-being of the public. And as long as that's the case, it's going to be very hard to pass any reform because one side or the other is going to feel advantaged or disadvantaged and not get on board with it. Just a discouraging story, I know.
Well, it gives us some insight, right? That sometimes the intransigence causes gridlock or causes inability for even participation in dialogue, right?
Well, let me give you one more hopeful take on the whole thing, which is that in the time I've been working on these kind of things, there's been a growing public awareness of alternative ways to structure things. And more people interested in it, working on it, and having successes in it, whether that is ranked choice voting or to some extent, not as much as everybody had hoped, campaign finance reform and the open primaries. We see these things spreading around the country and voters often feeling like, I don't even know what it is sometimes, but it's got to be better than what we have now. So the hope lies in the fact that people are very aware of this problem and willing to get behind it. In one way or the other, if they haven't been so discouraged that they don't even pay attention anymore.
Yeah. So Sass, as we turn to you next, I think from that last comment, we do see apathy, right? Or maybe fatalism. We do see hopelessness in the system. And, I think from my perspective, I work hard to, think about opportunities and solutions and ideas and painting a better picture. Sass, do you have any perspective in the work that you do, talking with volunteers? You're in the midst of qualifying a statewide ballot measure right now. What is the sentiment from your volunteers and as they're out talking with people, right? Can you share any sort of perspectives on the nature of people's awareness about the problems and and then, maybe pivot to what it is that fuels your work and your desire to make things better.
Yeah, so we see everything, right? So we see increases in despair, but we also see that as a motivating factor for some people. It radicalizes some people. It just brings more awareness to some folks. We see, some people standing their ground on the current system or whatever it is. We just see everything is getting heightened. And you can thank social media and all that, but also we're just getting into an intense period of time. And, for me, it's kind of interesting because I was thinking, like, we go back a little bit, like, my plan was to escape the country. I was like, I'm done with this. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I was like looking at like apartments in like New Zealand and Auckland, and I was like about to call them up and do all this, and then COVID hit, and I was like, all right, I gotta delay low for a sec, but I kind of thought about it, and I kind of was watching the country kind of fall apart, and I was like, man, I can't do that. I can't leave everybody behind like that. Like, I can do something about this, and so I am, and that's what it is that I decided I'm gonna do something about all this stuff. And really, like, my approach, the way I think about it, and I said this in my intro, is like, how can I be the absolute most effective? I have a limited time and resources. How can I be the most effective in that? And when I look at all of these different problems, when I look at the money in politics, when I look at the gerrymandering, when I look at like, why do partisan primaries exist in the first place? It's like I'm able to trace a lot of it back to like one of these core central things, which is vote splitting, which is a mechanic that some voting methods have and some voting methods don't, and that we can actually eliminate vote splitting with better voting methods like star voting, approval voting, rank robin, through the initiative process, and that it can absolutely be effective. And that if I'm going to spend, however many thousands of seconds out of every day working on something, that is going to create the most change, especially in a country like the United States that is a military superpower that's causing poverty all around the world, and economic superpower, and it just sucks up world news like it's nothing else, and nobody else ever gets any airtime anywhere else in the world. That like, this is where the change needs to happen, and that's why I moved 2,300 miles across the country to work on it. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of like, what we get from like volunteers and stuff, yeah, like I said, it's all over the place. Some people, they're like, oh my God, I've been looking for something. I'm so glad you told me about this. I've always been wondering what the solution should be. And some people are like, oh yeah, I've been like wanting to do this for a while, wanting to get involved. Some people are like, oh, that just sounds like a simple improvement. And we see responses from all over the place. But if you can keep your messaging focused, and you can demonstrate why the thing that you're working on is the thing to work on, and why and how it connects and fuels everything else, you can be incredibly effective with the change you're trying to make.
Yeah. Does any of the panel want to jump in and make any comments, anything coming to mind? I can certainly queue anyone up with a question, but I just wanted to open it up for the panel to chime in. Sandra, do you want to talk to the ways in which your ballot measure initiative in Nevada was able to find success, right? I mean, what the opposition was saying, what you and your volunteers were saying, and how you were able to overcome the opposition of the two major parties, right? Because they hold all the chips and they hold all the money.
Right. And I have to say, perfect pronunciation of Nevada, so I appreciate that. It's a thing here. Don't say Nevada when you're on a Zoom with the people from Nevada, because they'll get all at you. But I had worked on redistricting reform before I had worked on the ballot question for open primary, so I knew not to trust either one of the parties because they're just self-interested when it comes to these types of issues. They calculate, like Alan said, does it benefit me or not right at this moment? So we didn't expect to actually align ourselves with either party, and they quickly came out against us. Both parties did. And I had a reporter call me, and she's like, man, everybody's mad at you. And I said, I know, isn't that awesome? that means we're doing something right. They're all pissed at us. And she kind of laughed and she goes, yeah, I guess you're right. She goes, I would feel something was suspicious if they were actually aligning with you. But we made sure that when we came out, we were very clear about what we were doing, why we had our statistics, our PowerPoint on how many nonpartisan voters and all that. And so we really didn't get a pushback right at the very beginning. But the Democrats, the Democratic Party here, it's the Reid machine here. They were the ones that came out after us. What they did is they found some communities of color within their coalition to do a press conference to say that ranked choice voting was too confusing for people of color and therefore was a racist system and we shouldn't be doing it. And we were ready for that. And because our coalition has a lot of people of color on it who are supporting our ballot question, they were ready to come out and say that's kind of a racist thing to say. We're not stupid. We can understand things. But it was disheartening to have that conversation as opposed to a conversation about how ranked choice voting works and, about what top 5 would do. So what we tried to do is we spoke back to what was being said about us and said, we're not going to have this conversation anymore. This is just a red herring. And so Nevada is a small enough state, and the people who are on our coalition are well enough known around the state. And especially with the pandemic and the advent of Zoom, we've just been doing a lot of meetings that look just like this, where it's 20 people, 30 people, 5 people jumping on a Zoom, going through the PowerPoint, running through the videos of how ranked choice voting works, answering questions, but looking people in the eye and saying, I'm not trying to hurt you, but we're frustrated, aren't we, as Nevadans? And they would say, yes, I just need to know that this is going to fix it. And so it kind of ended up being a literal, I teach Latin American studies, an insurgency. We were out like organizing in the jungle and every so often would come out into the streets. But for a lot of what we were doing, they couldn't see us because we were on Zoom. We were, instead of going to somebody's house and sitting in the living room, we were on Zoom meetings. But that means I could Zoom with somebody in Elko. I could Zoom with somebody in Winnemucca. I could Zoom with the people in the rural areas. And now it's like, oh, yeah, it's Sandra. I know Sandra. She's the civics lady that talks about voter registration all the time. And so it was very personal. It was a lot of like grassroots organizing, just talking to folks. And it really shocked the power structures here because they were sure they had crushed us. And we won with 53% of the vote. So they were really taken aback. They were like, what were you guys doing? We're like, you'll never know. We're going to go organize in the jungle again for a while. We'll be back. Right. And so sometimes just being quiet and having face-to-face conversations that's the right way to do it.
Awesome. Such great insight. Thank you for sharing that. Marty, do you want to chime in?
I just wanted to briefly say the playbook against this is always divide and conquer. That it's, oh, well, if you like ranked choice voting, then you'll love star voting, and so I just make a point of supporting all of them. I said, look, if more than one makes the ballot, I'm going to vote for both, and usually what happens is whoever gets the higher vote total wins, but historically that's how they fight these things. And so I guess don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. One of the things we found out from the Portland voters when they did their charter reforms was, the charter reform policy had some ups and downs, but you know what? They're like, anything's better than what we got. Like, we'll take it and we'll fix it if we need to, but we're willing to try anything else. And that's kind of where I am with the closed primary system.
Yeah. Marty, while you're on, can you speak to the incentives that elected officials have to live under that are propagated by the two parties? Right. So the idea that getting primaried is a verb, right? Or the idea that you could get drawn out of your district, or your district composition can drastically change.
Well, I'll give you a concrete example. In my first run, we spent about $400,000, 120 to 150 of which I raised myself. So but the majority of it came from major party donors. And so and I was unusual in that I have always run small donor campaigns in the sense of I go out and get individual donations for 25 or 50 or $100 or whatever it is. And not that I don't have larger ones, because that's the game we play right now, but I've always I think I had 600 different donors my first campaign. And that's, I think, the way it should be done, because then you're talking to people. But that's what you're dealing with, is the reality that they can outspend you doing that. And that's because they can concentrate their resources on a small number of races, right? So if you don't toe the line, then the large donors from either party, frankly, will come for you in the next election. And and can you beat that back? Yeah, if you've been around a while, and the voters know you real well. But for newer politicians, it's pretty unrealistic to lose. If you lose the support of a public employee union on the Democratic side, you can really end up in trouble in your primary, even if you are closest to what the voters want, because they will just outspend you. I would also say one thing: if you talk to people, almost all of them hate negative campaigning. And the closed primary system really encourages it. Whereas when you look at ranked choice voting, you want people to put you number one, but you also want everybody else's number two, for your opponent, in case they end up lower on the ballot and get eliminated. So you don't want to throw too much mud. And so I think you're trying to get, at the end of the day, these open primary systems and ranked choice voting systems really encourage a more positive and moderate style of campaigning and governing. And I think, and more collaborative too, frankly. Like I once had a town hall with Mike Neerman, before his troubles, and I had people who were just aggravated that that I would even sit down with him and talk to people, because he's a district neighbor of mine. I was neighbor to mine in some respects, and I said, why wouldn't I? And then you wouldn't think we'd have much in common. He was a very conservative Republican. I was a fairly liberal Democrat, but we ended up having like schools outside the urban growth boundary that had growth issues, and so it was a totally nonpartisan issue. We just worked on it together and got the bill through. But it was just so polarized that people didn't think Mike Neerman could ever have a good idea, and a lot of it was just the negativity encouraged by this.
Yeah, Alan, go ahead and unmute, Alan.
Wanted to share an anecdote from 2016 when I ran for Secretary of State as the Green Party candidate, and I was talking about ranked choice voting and the problems of our current system at all these events, along with Dennis Richardson, the Republican candidate, and Brad Avakian, who was the Democratic candidate. They were both interested in what I had to say, and they sat there even when I talked about how they're putting on a real friendly face in front of you right now, but they're going to unleash a lot of negative campaign ads against each other. And as I've gotten to know them, they are nice people. They feel forced to do this because how our political system runs. It makes it to your advantage to discourage as many people as possible from voting for the opponent, even if they don't vote at all. So negative campaigning is directly correlated with the kind of voting system you have in my mind. And it was just interesting to me that both of them always welcomed me, were always friendly to me, listened attentively, even as I was criticizing their behavior forced by the system they're in. Is almost, they didn't say this outright, but it was almost as if, yeah, I have to deal with that. I hope somebody could change it.
So it's at this time that I really want to create a group discussion and a group dialogue. And so I want to open up the floor to anyone who's attending today to just raise your hand, and I'll call on you if you have a question that you'd like to direct at a speaker. Feel free to jump in and get us started. So I'll start with Michael Ng. Go ahead and unmute yourself and then ask the question. Yeah.
Hi there, thanks. Sandra, I was wondering in Nevada, if you picked up any kind of urban-rural divide. I know obviously Las Vegas is the largest urban area along with Reno, probably the most Democratic, most liberal. Here in Oregon, I think it's something like 30 out of 38 counties have the plurality of the registered voters are actually independents. non-affiliated or independent voters or minor party voters. And I was just wondering if you picked up any urban-rural dynamics, and if so, how you approached that and how those voters responded to your initiative.
Sure. So it was interesting because when you do like the 60,000 foot view, it looks very much like we've got blue Clark County where Las Vegas is and blue Washoe County where Reno is. So we thought, okay, that's where most of our votes are going to be. The rurals are red. They're not going to want to hear us. But I would highly, highly recommend do not get stuck in that trap. You need to go way down to the like ground level to look to see what's going on, because there are Democrats that live in our rural areas, but the Democratic Party here never runs people in our county, city, and state elections. So they're completely shut out of deciding who gets to represent them, because in our state, if you win in the primary, if you get 51% of the vote, that's it, the election's over. So it's not the top two from the closed primary. So those Democrats get no choice whatsoever unless they re-register as Republicans. And so some of them do that, but they don't want to re-register as Republicans. So we've got those folks who are out kind of in the rural areas. But we've also got Republicans out in the rural areas who feel like big old monstrous Clark County always puts up the state level candidates and they have no say. And then once we started explaining, no, if you have open primary top 5, you might have a candidate that's going to want you to be their second choice. And so I was showing them what Lisa Murkowski did in Alaska, where Lisa Murkowski went to the Democratic voters and said, please rank me second. And then they were able to get her as the Republican they preferred. So even at that level, having conversations with people one-on-one and asking them, do you like the system the way it is now? And when they say no, listen to why they say why, and then start from that point to show them how your reform is going to address their thing. You can bring them along. And so it's a lot of individual, small group discussions to make sure you don't inadvertently miss, and we had people in the urban areas that are dyed-in-the-wool party supporters that were not going to support us. So it was a good thing that Monroe County ended up going for us. And that's because there's an Indian reservation there. And so we're like, okay, on our next time around, we're visiting all the Indian reservations. But it was just a lot of individual discussions with people. And here's what we found. Nobody's happy with the system the way it is.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments from the audience? Anyone want to chime in with your thoughts or your feedback for any of the panelists, or questions about IP16 for open primaries here in Oregon? Or, we have SAS here with star voting for a new preference voting method as well. So, looks like Robert Close. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Robert, and chime in.
Okay, hello. I wonder if any of the panelists could say what lessons can be learned from the 2020 Massachusetts vote on ranked choice voting, which failed even though the proponents vastly outspent the supporters vastly outspent the opponents.
Democratic Party strong there.
That I'll speak to it. Ranked choice voting is a little bit more complicated than you might think it is. That's why I work on star voting. That's why I support approval voting, ranked robin. That's why I also support score voting, 3-2-1 voting, and so many other methods that achieve better results. But yeah, you're right. It was kind of a wild thing to see. And there have been a lot of other failures of ranked choice voting. The first time Alaska tried it back in 2002, it only got about 30%. We've seen it failed just recently to get adopted in 2 counties in Washington State. We've seen it get adopted and failed to be implemented in Austin, Texas, and Sarasota, Florida, and Memphis, Tennessee. That was before the states banned ranked choice voting. And that's why I don't work on ranked choice voting. There are a lot of reasons, but yeah, there are serious issues, and it doesn't eliminate vote splitting. For example, in the Alaska election, Peltola is great. I got nothing against Peltola, but 53% of voters preferred Nick Begich over her, and 61% of voters preferred Nick Begich over Palin. And it was kind of weird that ranked choice voting didn't elect Nick Begich in that way. He did a better job of getting the broad support, but ranked choice voting didn't count all of the ballot data. So I know this isn't what Michael wanted this conversation to turn into, so I feel like I may have already gone too far. But Massachusetts is only one example, and it's we've seen that, you know, from repeals to whatever else, ranked choice voting isn't the most sustainable reform.
I actually think it's because there's more Democrats there and they don't want their party to lose power.
Well, ranked choice voting took San Francisco from 1.5 parties to 1 party. Republicans don't run in San Francisco anymore because their candidates just get eliminated and then votes just get exhausted or transferred.
That's because
So-
they do top 2 though.
No. In San Francisco, they don't. They just do ranked choice voting. Whoever wins the ranked choice voting election wins.
Oh, and they're one election, right? Okay, at the municipal level.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but to me, ranked choice voting is clearer when you have to explain it from a math perspective.
Right. So
Like-
there's always this tension between which reforms maybe are the most viable or the most plausibly approved by voters, right? And then maybe which are the gold standard options, right? And so this is, I think, back to Representative Wilde's comment about you know, the idea that we ought to maybe all try and support each other, and because ultimately the folks who steer us and steer the narrative can exploit those cracks, right? So Martin, can you go ahead and chime on in?
Sandra, I was wondering what tactics or what was the tactical method you used to get enough people engaged in the conversation? Nevada is a big state. There's only 2 areas that have large populations. Reaching a lot of the state, like you talked about, that's a lot of turf to cover. What tactics did you use to get people even on the Zoom call?
Right. So because ours was a ballot initiative started by the people, not through our legislature, we had to get 190,000 signatures. And so we spent about $1.5 million hiring a ton of signature gatherers and spreading them out across the state. So having conversations with people at the time that they signed the petition and making contact with them so that we could reach back out to explain the process as it was going along. So it's worth it if you have to gather signatures, just to invest a lot of money into having signature gathering and voter outreach happening at the same time. The coalition of people that we have working on ballot question 3. So I work at the College of Southern Nevada. Great Basin College is in Elko. Western Nevada College is in Carson City. Truckee Meadows is in Reno. I know faculty at every single one of those colleges. So it's not hard for me to be able to find somebody out pretty much anywhere that I can do as a point of contact to set up a meeting. I'm also on a bunch of statewide commissions with the Secretary of State's office. So it's useful when you put together your coalition to be thinking about, okay, like if Sass was on our coalition, I would be thinking about the groups he's in contact with. And if Michael was going to be, what does his map look like? Because you want to make sure that everybody has a phone, they can call a phone, they can do a Zoom, and they can get you a meeting with the folks you need to talk to. So you got to do a lot of front loading at the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. And for IP16, we plan to start signature gathering in May. That's when we're projected to have approval for statewide signature gathering. And I know that for Star voting, they are already in the midst of statewide signature gathering. So kudos to them for being so far ahead of the game. Alan, can you go ahead and chime on in?
Yeah, thanks. On the topic of different voting reforms competing with each other, I just wanted to say that almost all of them could be made compatible with each other. You could have campaign finance reform, you could have open primaries, you could have redistricting reform. The only exception really is ranked choice voting and star voting, and that's because they each have a different way of voting on the ballot. One ballot you rank candidates, the other ballot you score candidates on the ballot. So it would be difficult, to say the least, to have voters presented with different ways of scoring or ranking people on the same ballot, and that would get very confusing. So unfortunately, those two, in a sense, go head to head, and you have to suss out the differences between them in order to fully understand the choice you're making. Otherwise, I say all of the above is great.
Got it. So I'm going to wrap us up here in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but I just wanted to continue to provide any opportunities for folks who are gathered here. I see Levi representing Forward Party Oregon. Thanks for being here, Levi. And I see Amari from the Oregon Value and Belief Center. Thanks for being here, Amari. But does anyone else have any thoughts or comments, questions, or feedback, points of discussion? Levi, go ahead. Chime on
Yeah,
in.
you just mentioned me, and I'm on here twice. The other one's Sean. Okay, I'm not a doubly on two computers. Yeah, and so there's two Ford people here now. But yeah, there's actually a lot of candidates here. Sass has run. I've run. Marty, of course, was successful. There's just several candidates here. So a lot of people, like half the people here, have been directly impacted by closed primaries in one way or another. And I love that point you guys made earlier on where you said most of the races in America are just one party, right? It's usually they're safe seats. And so many of the like independent redistricting, looking at money in politics, those are great, but they don't impact the majority of races. And so this initiative, this open primaries, directly in the vast majority of outcomes. And I think that's something most people aren't aware of. And maybe like in our elevator pitch, we could mention that a bit more. It's like, yeah, that was just one little thing I noticed.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Levi. Michael Ng, go ahead.
Yeah, Donna Cohen was on the call, and she had to check out. But I've sat in. She teaches civics classes for adults through the public libraries. It's really great stuff that she teaches, a whole variety of things. But she had to leave, but she wants to look at the recording, and she was wondering if you could help kind of distinguish between the two initiatives, the All Oregon Votes Constitutional Amendment Initiative, and then the Final Five initiative that's also being contemplated, if you could help her understand the differences.
Yeah, certainly. So IP16, which is being supported by All Oregon Votes. If you want to learn more, it's alloregonvotes.org. IP16 is a constitutional amendment that would confer rights, the right of participation for all voters, regardless of party affiliation, and the rights of all candidates to participate in the primary, regardless of party affiliation. And then the candidate's ability to choose, amongst any, the voter's right to choose amongst any candidate listed. And so it sets up parameters for how a primary system should operate, but it doesn't define specifically the outcome of that system. So it allows for flexibility in both the number of candidates to advance, top 2, top 3, top 4, top 5, top 6. We don't know 100% for certain. Democracy is always going to be a work in progress. And so, we could, we don't want to define exactly which voting method should be enacted, and we don't want to define exactly how many candidates should advance. And so that's why we do a constitutional route for IP16, so that the legislature can take up a lot of the nitty-gritty detail making of the resulting system. Now, there is a new initiative petition on the table where they want to prescribe a statutory solution to the primary question, and they want to model it in the vein of Final Five voting, right? And so I believe it's about 45 pages long of statutory changes, and I think it's called IP19. And that is also on the table. And so we see a lot more activity in this space. And I think of Martin Luther King Jr. and the multiple lanes to create multiracial democracy, and how we shouldn't get so fixated on how we should unify as one behemoth organization and pick one solution and just do that. I think we're stronger by traveling in multiple lanes and by making outreach and by posing these questions and by challenging the status quo. And I think then uniting behind good solutions that have the solid content and the solid support to make it happen. So Levi, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. You might have answered this question previously, but we're doing a few good ballot measures around here around the same time. Can you get multiple signatures for different ballots, or do you have to have different canvassers for each measure?
No, it's a great question. And you can certainly have one single canvasser carrying 3 different clipboards, right? And so I think that presents a really exciting opportunity that if you have a volunteer who wants to solve more than one problem at once, because look, right, these problems are big and they didn't happen overnight and there's no one silver bullet. But if we can agree on the general future we want to see, right, that gives more power to voters and less to a narrow group of moneyed or special interests, then I think that we can agree to support all of these different ideas in concert, right, so that we can leverage each other's success. If we're doing a David Goliath thing, and so if we are aiming to beat Goliath, then we have to be pretty scrappy about it, right? So. It's 8:15. I don't want to keep people here longer than is necessary. AllOregonVotes.org is our website. Sass, I don't know if you want to give a quick star voting, equal.vote, right?
Yeah, equal.vote or starvoting.org. We have it's technically 2 different organizations, but it's all a lot of overlap. But yeah, IP11, and we are actively collecting signatures right now. So if you're like gritting your teeth and you're like, I just want to start collecting signatures right now, I can't wait, contact us. We'd love to get a clipboard into your hands and get you going. It's super exciting, and you can start getting your momentum going. So when these other initiatives get approved, you can add them to your clipboard as well.
And we don't want to forget about Nevada with Sandra, because you are up again in 2024, right?
Yep, 2024. And right now we're in the middle of our legislative session. So the political parties are focused on that. So once again, we can organize and talk to people while they're not paying attention to us.
Sandra, do you have a legislative referral process for your initiatives in Nevada like we do here in Oregon?
Yeah, so you can go one of 2 routes. If you want to do it citizens initiative, then you do the petitions with the signatures. Or if you can get a legislator to sponsor it, then they just need to run it through the legislature 2 sessions back to back. Then it goes out for a vote of the people. That's the cheaper way of doing it. If you want to do it we the people, then it costs you $1 million.
Did you pursue that strategy at all?
No, because we knew the parties would hate us.
It was a non-starter, right?
We knew that wasn't going to happen. But yeah, so we just decided to raise the funds. I mean, it was not too hard to raise the funds, but we went that route.
Okay. And Mark Porter, go ahead and unmute yourself and chime in.
I was just going to ask Sandra, do you have to collect signatures again for the second ballot?
No, once you've qualified, you stay qualified. It just has to be 2 votes of the people. And so it'll just be on the ballot for the next time. Now I would like to shake things up and start using electronic signature. That scares the politicians around here.
But doesn't electronic signatures have a high rejection rate? Like they check your signature based on your like 20 years ago signature and then say, oh, I'm sorry, a lot of your people don't qualify.
So here's what I would do. So in the state of Nevada, we have online voter registration. When you log into your online voter registration account, they show you your signature that's on your driver's license or DMV issued ID, and they ask you, is that your signature? And you say yes. And they say, would you like to affix it to your voter registration form? And you say yes. I would like all the petitions to also be in that online voter registration portal. And if you want to sign, you say, please take my signature that I see right here and affix it to that petition. Now there's no verifying signatures or anything because only you can be in your account.
That's smart. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot.
So tonight we're going to see Dr. Sandra Cosgrove and Marty Wilde announce a joint race for Secretary of State, respectively, right, guys? So that we can work on these democracy reforms from the inside.
really cool thing actually related to what Sandra was talking about. So we collected signatures for a local initiative for Star Voting in Eugene a couple of years ago, and it got blocked by Lane County Elections illegally because of signature verification process. And we're fighting them in court right now. We're in the Oregon Supreme Court. Basically, when you go to vote, if your signature gets rejected, you have a process to reconcile that. You don't have that with petition initiatives. And that should be, those should be consistent. And so we are fighting that. And when we have a really good case and when we win, that's going to guarantee better enfranchisement for voters all across Oregon. And I also recently met somebody, and we need to talk some more about the organizations, but they're in Oregon and they're working on a program on software that can automatically go through and scan all your signature sheets and compare them to the public voter file database and do an automatic signature check and like flag the ones that are not as great or whatever. And so like that's also super exciting for signature verification that this technology is coming up. So that's also a really cool way. So, for states that don't get to do the thing where you can go online and sign within the context of your voter registration file or whatever, there are other workarounds that I think are really, really cool.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say one last thank you to all of the panelists and all of the folks who tuned in today. I really appreciate the discourse, the dialogue, the civility of the discussion, and how we're all rowing the boat in the same direction. And we got to keep rowing and not lose hope and continue to add to our ranks. And so that's what we're called to do. I'm called to head upstairs and kiss my wife. So thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next time around. So have a good
Thanks,
evening.
everybody.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank you.
so much.